Welcome to the Legendarium, brought to you by our amazing patrons. By the way, if you enjoy the show, please head to thelegendarium.com and find the link to become a patron yourself. Today is another Author's Shelf episode. We've been doing a lot of these lately, which I refuse to apologize for because they're really, really great. It's quickly becoming my favorite series on the show, honestly. And today you'll get another reason as to why. But anyway, as a reminder, the Author Shelf episode in this series, the Author Shelf series, we invite a best-selling author onto the show, but instead of your typical interview, we ask them to pull a beloved or influential book from their shelf for us to read and discuss with them. Just a different way for us to get to know our favorite authors. Today's book is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Not our typical fare, but just trust me, read the book if you haven't ever before. Read it, enjoy it, and listen to this episode anyway. It's okay. All right, let's introduce our panel. I'm your host, Craig Hanks, and over there, if you ever find her washed up on the shore from a sailing accident, well, it probably wasn't me. It's Stephanie Bruckman.
Yeah, it was probably my own fault, so.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. And I'm sure she would make a fine English housekeeper right up until she talked you out of an open third-story window. It's Alyson Noël.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Very glad you're here, Alyson. How are you doing today?
Really good, thanks. Excited to be here.
Me too. Now, Alyson, you're here in part because you are promoting a new book that's coming out. What's the name of that book?
Stealing Infinity. It'll be out next Tuesday, June 28th.
June 28th. All right. So Stealing Infinity. We're going to talk about that for a few minutes at the end of the episode. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit about that, stick around. But for now, let's talk about Rebecca. I'll give you a little summary and then you can stop listening to me talk the whole time and we can get into it. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is the 1938 Gothic novel that tells the story of a young English woman, our unnamed narrator. While living abroad, she's caught up in a whirlwind romance with a widower, Maxim de Winter, who marries her and takes her back to his grand estate, Manderley. All is going well, right up until we remember that this is a Gothic novel, so of course it's not. The narrator is haunted, certainly figuratively and at times seemingly literally, by the ghost of Maxim's dead wife, Rebecca. Beautiful, talented, outgoing, Rebecca was beloved by everyone, by the townsfolk, the other gentry, the household staff, and especially Maxim himself. Our poor narrator feels like she'll never measure up. And so she gradually descends into paranoia, anxiety, perhaps even psychosis. What happened to Rebecca? Can Maxim ever love his second wife like he loved his first? And is the housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, the most evil character I've read in a long time? Yes, she definitely is. But for the rest of it, you'll just have to pick up the book and find out. All right, so that is Rebecca. Alyson, I'm going to ask you the same first question I ask everybody on the Author Shelf series, which is, why did you pick this book?
Listen, this is my copy of Rebecca that is ancient, dog-eared. I've had it since high school, which was a really long time ago. And I remember reading it when I was younger and just being so pulled into the story, just completely enthralled. I'm pretty sure I faked sick so I could stay home from school and finish reading it. I would do that a lot when I loved a good book and I just didn't want to go to school. I needed to know how it ended. And it's all the things you said. It's a character that, sort of marries out of her station and ends up in this totally dreamy house. And it seems like your classic, we're going to go on a Cinderella adventure story. This woman's been rescued by the dashing hero with the beautiful home and her life will be changed. And it certainly changed, just not in the way that the reader is expecting and certainly not in the way that the new Mrs. De Winter is expecting. And there's so many twists and turns and dark corners and shadows and mysteries and a hint of the supernatural. And it just had all the ingredients I love. And I've read it throughout the years. I saw the most recent movie adaptation on Netflix. And, it's just, there's a lot of books I could have picked, but I just decided to go with this one. It also gives a little hint to like kind of what I was trying to do with Stealing Infinity, being that the character who's sort of out of her element. Everyone has a secret no one's letting her in on. And so there's a certain, conspiracy and paranoia that starts to develop. Is it me or is it them or what's really happening here?
Yeah. So you feel like this influenced you in a direct or at least indirect way then?
Sure. Yeah.
Stephanie, how did it go for you? Had you read this one before, or was this new to you?
I had not. I had actually, my first introduction to Rebecca was the Netflix movie. I
Mm.
watched that one on Netflix that came out not too long ago. And so I had that idea. So this is the first time I picked up the book. And I have to admit, I struggled getting through the book my first time.
Yeah.
Um, up until probably about 60% of the way through. I don't know how much, I mean, I'm not spoiling anything, right? I can
Just
talk.
don't give away the last 50 pages or so, but yeah, go for it.
Okay, it's about the time that Maxim actually admits what happened to Rebecca and what he did,
Mm.
and that first real conversation he has with our narrator that finally changed my viewpoints of the book, where you actually see the narrator come more into herself. It's that moment where she grows up. And that was the moment that I finally started relating to her as the narrator and going, okay, I can understand this. As before, it felt very childish with her, which I think is part of the point of the writing anyway, is that she's very young with an older gentleman. And so that moment where she grows up is where I finally started connecting and
Mm.
enjoying the book a lot more.
I love how young she is in the beginning, where she doesn't even know quite. She's so unsure of herself that she's unsure of what words to use or like what register to speak in. So she'll say something, "Oh yes, absolutely cracking," and then she'll immediately go, "Why did I? Come on, why did I? No, nobody says this, or whatever. I don't remember what the word was, but yeah, no, she does a lot of growing up in this book. What I was at the beginning of this book, what I was reminded of more than anything, and try not to laugh, Titanic. Um, so if Titanic had been a bleak, dark, hopeless romance, because at the beginning of it, it's we get this prologue where I dreamed I was back at Mandalay, or whatever the line is, I can't remember. But then she's going through this kind of like hollowed out, burned out old estate, and she's remembering the grandeur of it. And it's very much like that scene in Titanic where they go down with the submarine and they're getting the pictures, and you get little flashes of how grand and wonderful it was. And then as the story then begins, and she she goes to the house, or in Titanic, you go to the ship and you see how wonderful it was. And obviously they diverge in their intent as stories, but I really enjoyed that beginning of it. Frankly, I was sucked in from the very beginning, if by nothing else, or if by nothing other than the writing. What's it, Daphne du Maurier is really, really talented with her prose style. But anyway, all right. So Alyson, we'll go through. We'll just do like I said before, a freewheeling discussion. And so I'm curious what if I'm curious if there's something about this book that has kept you drawn to it. You said you came to it as a teenager. You're reading it back in high school, and you keep watching the adaptations and coming back. What is it about this story? Is it that main character? Is it the intrigue? Is it what really sucks you in?
It's interesting. I mean, because my sort of relationship to the book has really changed. I remember reading it as a teen and just being completely sucked into the world. And I think I also felt like she did. I felt like an outsider a lot of the time. I felt like I didn't really belong anywhere in particular. I felt like second guessing what I would say, not really in charge of my personhood. And, so I could relate to her at that time. I mean, I think Rebecca, or she's not Rebecca, the new Mrs. De Winter, we never get her name, is, which I also find really interesting. We never learn her name. But, I think she's very much a product of her time, in that she is kept really young and naive from the world. There's so much she doesn't know. And she's so dependent on other people just for her very livelihood. We meet her and she's acting as a companion to this older woman who's not particularly nice to her. And then she goes from this woman who, to Maxim, who really treats her like a child. And so to prepare for this podcast, I'm really busy on deadline right now, so I didn't have time to do a reread of the book, but I did an audio listen to it. And the audio narration was great. It was a really good narrator. But listening to Maxim, like in my ear now as an adult, so many years later, like really listening to him, I was like, this guy is the worst. Like, he's so patronizing to her and he's so belittling to her, and he knows how out of her element that she feels. And he's not really very kind to her once they reach the house, until a little bit later in the book. And then the dynamic of the relationship changes. And yeah, like Stephanie said, when she grows up, when she finally decides to grow up and sort of meet Maxim as an equal, he then begins to treat her as more of an equal. But I just, like, that kind of went over my head when I was younger. And maybe that has to do with the times that I grew up in, or the way that I was used to men interacting with women back then as compared to now. Some of that was a little glaring to me. But yeah, so I think like I've experienced this book and this narrator in different ways through different times in my life. I find the writing to be just really beautiful and extraordinary. There's a lot of description that I wonder that the younger me would read Wuthering Heights and finish it and then go right back to page 1. And I have a much harder time with books like that today, because storytelling has evolved and it happens quicker. And there's like you don't get as bogged down in describing a field of flowers and things like that. But she really takes her time to paint the picture of this place. And it's really an extraordinary picture that she paints. And when you're in her words and reading her prose, you really feel like you are immersed in Manderley and you are seeing it through the eyes of this wide-eyed young person that doesn't feel she belongs there. And, I had a great deal of sympathy for her as an adult, following her journey, and a moment of cheering for her when she does finally step into her own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the description point, the prose, the flowery prose about the flowers or whatever.
Yeah.
Being a fantasy podcast and, a Tolkien aficionado, believe me, I've heard every possible iteration of, he describes too many trees or whatever, he takes forever to describe things. And if I ever hear that from somebody who likes this book, I will throw it back in their face.
Yes.
I really quite enjoy that style. But I think I get what you're talking about, where, as much as I enjoy it, I have to recognize I have been conditioned, whether it's through TV and movies or through just the books that I tend to read. I've been conditioned to expect, okay, when's the next beat? When's the next plot point? And it's like, look, we're going to spend a chapter or maybe 2 chapters just kind of getting to know this character and her relationship to this particular spot in the manor, and that's okay. She writes it well enough that it kept me engaged.
Yeah.
But let me run one thing past both of you. My grand insight from this book was I finally realized why so many stories are set in, like, even today. My wife and I have been watching Bridgerton. Don't tell my mother, right? It's so good. I love Bridgerton. It's so good.
I do too.
But I realized why so many stories are set in kind of 19th century or maybe early 20th century England, with the kind of the well-heeled upper class, because it lends itself so well to stories that depend on tension, which is driven by miscommunication or just a total lack of communication. This is something that came up a lot when we did our Wheel of Time series, 5 years ago or whatever it was, where it's like, gosh, if you would just talk to each other, you would solve all your problems. Because that communication, it diffuses tension and it solves problems. And because of the rules of that polite society, that English society, effective communication is basically impossible. It's almost impossible. because almost nothing is said directly. They, if there's a problem, you avoid it. Or if you need to confront somebody about something, do it passive aggressively or go behind their back and see if you can get somebody else to do it. Right. And so because of those rules of politeness, it creates it's almost inevitable that you would get tension that is good for stories like this. I don't know. Stephanie, you love, what do you call it? The Regency romance. Yeah. How does that ring true for you, if at all?
I agree. Like, that is really what makes some of these stories so interesting, is because of the lack of communication. As a reader, I get frustrated, especially with a book like Rebecca, because really, if our narrator had just opened up and even asked the simple question to anyone about Rebecca, not even necessarily just Maxim, I think things would have ended up differently for her. She would have been happier sooner instead of the frustration, because there's so much of this book that I spent with, will you just talk to someone? And it got frustrating, which, as I think, is entertaining at times. Like, I love feeling like I'm involved and I care and I'm interested in what the decision-making process of these characters are. And Rebecca, definitely, this book fits directly into that lack of communication. If you would just talk to anyone. Of course, it also teaches me as a human now, going, okay, this is what happens when I don't communicate. Something's bothering me. Let me go talk to my husband now, so you don't end up, because obviously living those kind of situations is not as entertaining as it is reading about them.
No, absolutely. Yeah. What do you think, Alyson?
Oh, I agree. I mean, I remember a long time ago watching something. I mean, I was a kid and being like, if everybody just said what they meant or asked what they were wondering, all of this would be solved, But how often do people even do that really in real life? I mean, everyone's always holding something back or skirting around an issue, or, the majority of people fear confrontation or what they consider might turn into a confrontation, and they'll go out of their way to avoid a confrontation. And if you have someone like Rebecca, nothing in her background has made her ready for Maxim, Mrs. Danvers, or Manderley Estate. She literally is a child, and she hasn't been prepared for this at all. So as a reader and as an author, I think feeling frustrated is actually a good thing, because it means that you care. It means that you're involved, and it means that you're gonna feel a little elation when it finally comes around. But I think she had to earn that moment, and I think that it was a fun part of her arc. Was it was really a coming of age story for her. It really was.
I could see this being a much, much less effective book if she hadn't been a fish out of water. Yeah. If she had already been part of high society and she was just marrying into a different family. If she knew the rules of the road, she'd be much more effective at navigating them. Young as she was, she at least would have had a lot more exposure to that sort of thing. And now because she's an outsider, it's much more difficult for her. So yeah.
I mean, I think when I'm choosing characters for a book, I don't want to choose the main character to be fully capable and ready to handle what's in front of them or what they're going to face. I want to pick the one who absolutely is totally and completely ill prepared for the moment. And that's the journey to find their way to meet the moment and then overcome the moment, So yeah, it would be far less interesting if Rebecca just waltzed into this and started bossing around Mrs. Danvers.
The narrator. Oh, right. Yeah.
The narrator. Sorry.
It's like Frankenstein. Sure. Yeah. Let's just call her Frankenstein. Yeah, whatever. I wanted to ask you, as a writer, with this communication issue, is that something you consciously look for, like ways to make miscommunication part of the tension in a story, or does it arise kind of organically just by nature of the characters and you getting into their heads? How do you create something like that as an author yourself?
I always sort of work from an immersive point of so I'm not sitting there. I always feel like I'm inside the story when I'm writing. So I'm not like outside trying to direct like a scene between two characters and have them miscommunicate. I'm actually whatever POV I'm in. And so then I just sort of naturally, it feels organic to me. Like this is how she would respond to this because I know her background so well and she's not ready for this moment. And then this one over here is going to sense that she's not ready for this moment. And he's going to protect himself by reacting in this way. And so I always just sort of, do it from an organic sort of place of putting myself really in the shoes of the character. Not everybody writes like that. It's more of a chessboard, but I'm sort of inside it when I am creating my stories.
Yeah. I mean, the miscommunication thing is obviously, this is all over the place, but my head, because we talked about that so much with the Wheel of Time, and Stephanie at least knows what I'm talking about. That's where my head goes. And there are a couple of places in that series where I'm sitting there reading it going, Robert Jordan just had them not communicate so that he could have tension. And so most of the time I bought it just fine. But there were a few places where I'm like, this feels a little forced on the characters that they don't know what's happening with each other or whatever. Mm-hmm. But in Rebecca, it all felt, it all felt incredibly organic, incredibly easy to buy as a reader. So yeah, I really appreciated that aspect of it. Okay, so I've got some more bullet points and stuff that I can bring up, but do you guys have any points that you want to bring up, whether about the characters, the prose style, the structure, the whatever? I don't want to monopolize. So what about you, Stephanie?
So I did some research on Daphne
du Maurier.
I was like, I'm going to slaughter this. Craig, help me out. And I thought what was so interesting is how much her actual lifestyle and her own personal story fed into Rebecca and the way that she wrote. If you don't know anything about the author, she was kind of in that pre-transgender where she felt like she had a lot of relationships with other women because she felt like she was a man. But this was before transgender was a thing. And this whole idea of not being accepted by society, I think the more I read about her and her story and some of how she felt with her relationships and watching her husband when her husband had his affairs and everything, it really started making me feel like I was getting to know the author so well through the narrator of this book. And I don't know it, and I wouldn't have felt that if I hadn't done the research, if I hadn't looked more into, I was actually just looking up quotes from the book is what I was doing when I came across the biography of the narrator. And she is such an interesting woman. I don't know if either of you know anything more about her.
The narrator or Daphne du Maurier?
Daphne du Maurier.
No, I didn't look it up. I'm not as good a person or a podcaster as you are. So, no, the only thing I do know about, and we can circle back to that, but the only thing I did learn about is that there was some controversy with where did this story come from? And did she plagiarize it from this guy down in, it was like Brazil or Argentina or something like that? And, or did she plagiarize it from this person over here? And it was this whole mess.
It's a very Jane Eyre kind of story.
Yeah. Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So kind of just seems like one of those, it's in the air. Like this type of plot is just out there. And so I'll always be accused with this type of story of lifting it from somewhere, but I don't know. I'm sure there's more to the story.
It's a classic gothic romance novel, I mean, the elements are all there. And so it's the elements of a gothic romance novel. I think it's probably most closely related to Jane Eyre. And yet they're different books and it's a different experience reading each one. So,
yeah. So, Alyson, who is the worst character in the book? And I don't mean the worst written character. I mean the one you would least want to spend time with. Like who is the villain? Who's the worst person here?
Oh, Mrs. Danvers, for sure.
Okay, good.
Yeah, she's
So
terrifying.
tell people about Mrs. Danvers if they haven't read the book. Who's Mrs. Danvers?
Oh, Mrs. Danvers has been looking after Manderley, but more importantly, after Rebecca, since Rebecca was a very young child. And she's completely enamored with the idea of Rebecca because Rebecca's no longer with us. And nobody will take Rebecca's place, and certainly not the new Mrs. De Winter. And she's just a terror. And, I would get upset at times like, how can Max not see this? Why did Max keep her on? Why did he not fire her the moment, Rebecca turned up dead? I mean, of course, we wouldn't have a story then, so I'm glad he kept her. But yeah, she's just a terrifying, but also a sad, tragic woman. She had no life of her own. Her life was via Rebecca. It was through whatever Rebecca did. And, there is a bit of a tragedy with her, like with any good villain. I mean, I don't want them to be ever just all one thing. I think if you can put a little bit of personal tragedy in there, I don't know, it just makes it a little bit richer even.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because we have her on screen, I think it's good that she has some of that humanity, like some of backstory or reason for us to feel sorry for her, even as we hate her. Right. I think that's all great. Rebecca, on the other hand, and now I'm afraid for those listening, we are going to get into spoiler territory for this 90-year-old book. But with Rebecca, it's revealed in the end that she's not this perfect, angelic, wonderful person that the narrator feared that she was. I can never live up to the perfection that Rebecca displayed. Well, it turns out she was awful. And as these descriptions come rolling in at the end of the book about what kind of person she was, it's clear that Rebecca was a sociopath. And I use that word advisedly, like clinically, literally very much a sociopath, incapable of human connection or regret, or, she has no conscience. And so to your point, Alyson, I think if Rebecca had been alive and on screen in this book, she would have been a great villain in a way, but we as a reader can't connect with her. We can't form an emotional connection with her because we know that she's incapable of that connection. Mm-hmm. Whereas Mrs. Danvers is obviously somebody who is capable of that connection, and she did form that connection. She kind of, she's a barnacle on the rump of Rebecca going through life, and so when she dies, she has nothing left. Their interactions were chilling, just the worst. That kind of when the narrator first shows up at Manderley, and Mrs. Danvers is showing her around the house and is perfectly, unfailingly polite, but always with that undercurrent of, I'm going to stab you in the dark and you'll never see it coming. And it all builds and it builds and it builds until she actually does try to convince the new Mrs. De Winter to jump out of a window and kill herself, because what good are you? Nobody loves you. Max doesn't want you. Just jump. And it's awful. It's terrifying. Yeah, she's the worst. She's the worst. Stephanie, what say you?
I don't know if I can say much more about her, because she's a heartbreaking character, because you can see where her love and her passion for Rebecca has misguided her new relationships, that she is so in love with Rebecca and the life of Rebecca and the idea of who she feels Rebecca is, that it definitely it has tainted her and her relationships with all these other people, that to the point where, yes, she tries to convince another woman that she really doesn't even know to commit suicide because she's not Rebecca. And so I think that one scene reading through that was chilling. It really was, as you're listening to her sickly sweet idea of just jump. It's okay. Like, I was like, who, why? No, stop.
Normal people don't do this. All right, so let's change gears a little bit. and just talk about kind of what type of story this is. It's a gothic romance, which means that the way I kept picturing it as I was reading through it, and I often picture this when I read gothic stuff, is that it's like when you look at a picture negative and all of the colors are inverted. That's how I feel reading this. It's a bit like, if you read Shakespeare, it's like, is it a tragedy or a comedy? Pick one, and you kind of know the direction it's going to go. Even though they have a lot of the same kind of beats, the beats are serving a different purpose, and they're taking you down different paths, right? And I really enjoy a good happy ending romance, but I find myself really enjoying the gothic stuff as well, where it's a love story and it's a murder mystery and it's all these things that could lead to what is typically the happy ending. And in this, we don't really get that so much. What do you two prefer and why? Like the two sides of that coin, which side do you prefer and why? I'll kick it to you first, Alyson.
I always tend towards that. I mean, listen, I'm a huge Bridgerton fan. I love it. And I love a good Regency romance. But I really kind of have a leaning towards that sort of darker, more suspenseful thing. And I think Rebecca, without giving away spoilers, you don't get that classic happily ever after, but you get, two people who have finally connected in a more real way. Mm-hmm. It's not totally without satisfaction, because now they're finally on equal footing. And if anything, maybe she's a little bit stronger than Maxim by the end of it. And they're meeting each other again, having survived something together. That's made them both stronger. And I just kind of lean towards that, I guess. Yeah. What about you, Stephanie?
Jedi or Sith, Stephanie? Pick one.
I always prefer a romance. I am a romantic at heart. I have a hard time classifying this book as a romance because I don't think that the point of the book is supposed to be our narrator's relationship with Maxim and their love story. Like, I get at the very end, yes, they're together, they're married, and there is something, but it's so much more a coming of age novel that for me, I enjoy it because I really enjoyed it because it's not really a romance. That's not the point of the story. It's not the ending that we're trying to get to isn't the happily ever after. I think it's more of the narrator coming to realize that she doesn't have to be the child. She doesn't have to be treated like a child. Like that it's almost, I feel like if there was a sequel to this and we found out what happens between the end of the book and those first two chapters where she's reminiscing, that would be more of the romance story where you actually see where these two have built a relationship and what's happening as they're now together as equals, as opposed to this is more the narrator's story of getting to the point where she can have a romance, if that makes that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's really tricky to talk about something like this because we keep saying romance, but there's lowercase r romance that you're talking about, Stephanie, and then there's uppercase r romance, which the kind of the period in which these things are written and the style in which it's written, because it's not this isn't some kind of like clinical let's look at the clues and kind of murder mystery type of thing. This is much more like you were saying, Alyson, we spend a lot of time describing the flowers, and she has a paragraph about a bee buzzing to a flower and then going inside and falling silent. Sort of, it's the atmospheric, emotional that style. So regardless of what kind of romantic connection that they share, it's still technically a romance, even if we don't have that.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with Stephanie that the romance isn't necessarily the driving force. It's what got her to Manderley, then it's what happens to her at Manderley that really is the A story, the driving narrative of this. It's the engine that got her there. but it's really about her journey. You know, I would agree with you, Stephanie, on that. It's really more of a coming of age more than a romance, like a classic boy meets girl obstacle. They come together. Now they're, you know, it's darker than that, and it's really about her growth as a character.
Yeah.
Well, and I think out of everyone, she probably has a stronger written relationship with Mrs. Danvers than she does with Maxim. You get so much more of their interactions together, the way that they communicate with each other, than she really does. Then you find out really anything with her and Maxim and how they communicate with each other, because most of it is just Maxim kind of brushing her off as being just ignorant. You're sweet. You're there. Thank you for being here. Where her conversations with Mrs. Danvers are a lot more, there's more depth to them. There's more intrigue. There's more passion to them, which I think is kind of interesting as a romance novel, like that your relationship's really between two women and how they're viewing the narrator's new position in life.
Yeah. Let's meander our way toward the ending of this conversation. I want to talk about the structure of the book and how effective it was for me, and I'm curious if it was effective in the same way or a different way for you guys. We talk, so being Brandon Sanderson fans, right? Stephanie and I read a lot of Brandon Sanderson books. The community talks a lot about the Sanderlanche. There's a moment where you get to the story and then something falls, some domino falls, and the guts of the story just spill out everywhere, and your mind is blown, and it's, you know, face melting guitar solo, whatever. I felt like this book had that. But I bet it comes at different moments for people, where it's, you know, hey, I'm enjoying the book. This is, it's an interesting story. What well-drawn characters. I want to keep reading. And then there's a point where you're like, all right, I'm done with the rest of my life until I'm done with this book. And for me, it was the conversation when Mrs. Danvers tries to get her to jump out the window. And we are, by the way, I think we're safe to get into some spoilers for the 80-year-old book. So let's just talk about the ending. So she tries to do that. It doesn't work. And then it kind of, at that point in the story, the dominoes just start falling and falling and falling. We find out that that the body that was recovered wasn't actually Rebecca, and who killed her. And it turns out Max killed her, but for reasons that he gets into, because she was awful, because she was a terrible human being, and she probably manipulated him into it. And it's just like all these fireworks are going off, like stuff that the bricks that had been laid, you finally get to see what the path was and what it was leading to. What was the moment for the two of you, if you had one, where this story goes from I like it to I must finish it?
I would agree with you. It's when Danvers is trying to talk her out of the window. You know, I was in it from the start. Last night I dreamt of Manderley. I was like, oh, tell me more. You know, just the opening sentence, and I was already in. You know, it's just one of those lines that either sucks you in or not, because you want to know more about Manderley in this dream. But yeah, it gets really dark in that moment, and she has totally manipulated this young woman to this point, and really systematically broken her down to the point where she thinks, I'm really close to getting her to doing this, and then I can be done with her and just go back to this house of my memories of Rebecca without this woman interfering. And the new Mrs. De Winter doesn't do it, you know. But there's a moment where you assume she won't, because she's your narrator of your story, and you kind of need her to keep going to tell you the rest of it. And you know, she's dreaming of this. So, but at the same time, there's this feeling of this woman is so broken down and so weak, and will she attempt it? You know, and when she doesn't do it, we know that she's coming into her own. This story is going to take a turn. And we're going to start getting some answers. What's really going on in this dark, shadowy, secretive fortress of a house.
Yeah. Stephanie, did you have a moment, or did nothing like that quite land for you?
I think for me, it was her conversation with Max, where Max admits to her that he
Mm,
was the one who killed Rebecca, that
Mhm.
he was the one that after everything that Rebecca had done to him, how she had changed after that first week of marriage, and she wasn't the same person. And when he finally opens up to our narrator, I think for me was like, okay, now I need to know. Before that, I enjoyed it. It was a good book. I had every intention of finishing it. It's not like I've ever felt like I don't want to finish this. But that conversation right there, where I think you even that's the first glimpse we really see of the true Maxim as well. That really was like, okay, let's finish this. How quickly can I get through this now? Because this has gotten exciting.
I love that conversation in part because it does for Maxim what we've been talking about with Mrs. Danvers, where it humanizes the story that we've gotten about him up to that point. Where, yeah, he treats her terribly. He treats her like a child. After their kind of whirlwind romance, they get back to Mandalay and he's aloof and he's distant. He's busy. I have other things to worry about. I can't just babysit you, child, whatever. Um, and then we realize that what he did to his first wife, I certainly messed with his head, and what she did to him before that. And so he's incapable of maybe that kind of connection that he knows that he needs and wants to have, but he can't quite bring himself to cultivate in the right way. I love that conversation, and it changes the entire tenor of the book, where it's about her trying to figure out if she can live up to this memory of Rebecca, if she can become the woman in the house, whatever. And then on a dime in that conversation, even in her own head, it's okay, how can we make sure that he doesn't get caught? She says, I'll lie for him, I'll cheat for him, I will do whatever I have to do to make sure that he doesn't get punished for this crime or whatever. And it changes everything in that moment. I think that's a great one to pick out, Stephanie, for when the narrator kind of grows up, so to speak. Yeah.
It's a really fascinating turn. I mean, it's the first time we see Maxim as being vulnerable and human with her. It's the first time they're finally communicating with each other and forming this connection. And we get to see her go from this really naive girl to like, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure, Max isn't taken away or end up in jail or, and she's willing to lie, whatever it takes. And so they're finally coming together, these two, and it's over Rebecca, because of Rebecca.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Stephanie.
Well, there are so many fantastic quotes in this book, and I wrote down like so many of them because they're
Is it the
fantastic.
one about the bee going into the flower? Because, yeah, I know. Totally.
Yes, yes, definitely. But there was a moment where our narrator is talking about Rebecca and how if Rebecca was alive, if she was just some woman that her husband was having an affair with, she could deal with it. But how do you deal with someone who is dead? And that fear that she always had, and that pedestal that even not even knowing Rebecca, that she put Rebecca on. And I think having this conversation where you really find out who Rebecca truly was, there is a moment that our narrator has where the fear goes away. And I think that that was really powerful to me, of that idea of no longer being afraid, where she can finally come into her own. And that's when she finally starts standing up to Mrs. Danvers, when she finally really starts realizing that she has been afraid for so long that they're no longer, that it, part of her own problems that she's had have been her own fault. That,
Mhm.
and I think for so many people, that's a hard thing to always admit to yourself, to others,
Mm,
that this
Mhm.
is me. This was because of me. If I had tried and made an effort sooner, we would be in a different place. And I think that was another reason why that conversation was so powerful, is that moment she stopped. She had decided to stop being afraid.
yeah.
Mhm.
She she tries a lot through the book. I was frustrated with the narrator many times, especially through the first half of the book, with just say something, be assertive, try, and I'd have to pull myself back and go, okay, she's probably 19 years old, maybe something like that. She's a very young person. She doesn't have the wherewithal for something like that. So take it easy on her. And then at a certain point, she does start to make efforts. And, she's going out and she's trying to, she's making house calls to people around the town, and she's making an effort. She throws the party and she puts on the dress thinking, okay, I'm going to give everybody a good shock and a good laugh. It'll be great. But every time she makes one of those decisions and tries to assert herself, the world just punches her right in the face and says, no, you sit down. Like this poor girl goes through, I don't know. She goes through a lot, and it's pretty heartbreaking to read, honestly.
That part is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
That just broke my heart.
Well, let's wrap up with some final thoughts. Just any final thought you want on Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I will say that the more of these gothic novels I read, the more I really want to have my own very, very large estate, just because it seems like stories will happen there. And I'd love to have some stories. So, my little bungalow here in Utah just doesn't quite lend itself to the stories I feel like I need for my autobiography eventually. So, no, I really love the dark, lonely house on a hill. Like I'm coming to really enjoy that trope quite a bit. What about you, Stephanie? Any final thoughts?
I think the one thing that I would recommend is actually reading the book. My first time through this book was listening to it, and I feel like because of the way that she writes is so descriptive, I would have enjoyed it a lot more if I had the book in my hand where I could actually see the words, follow along with them, as opposed to just having them in my ear. So I recommend this book, and it's very rarely that I recommend just flat out reading a book and kind of skipping over the audio first, but I recommend read it, hold the book, read it, see the words, see how they're written and the way that the sentences go together. I think for this kind of book, that's kind of important.
I did both. So Whisper Sync for the win, right? So I had the Kindle edition, and then, if I was gardening, I'd put on the audiobook. And I think I agree with you for the most part, except that the narrator, and I apologize, I don't remember what her name is so good. Whoever read this book is so good at it that I do like her narration quite a bit. All right, Alyson, final thoughts on Rebecca.
Well, gosh, it was really interesting. I listened to it this time around, as opposed to all the times I've read it, this copy that's falling apart. And I thought the narrator was extraordinary, but I would agree. And I loved listening to it and her version of it. And I thought she really brought to life the beautiful writing. But I would agree with Stephanie. Like, it is a slightly more enjoyable experience to be able to sit down and savor those paragraphs and descriptions and let her pull you into the page of that story. I'm just really glad you guys liked it, because after I suggested it and sent that email, I was like, oh no, should I have done that? Should I have gone with something a little more fantasy? But I'm glad you liked it, that you gave it a chance. I mean, it's still, all these times later, in as many different ways as I've experienced this book at the different times and phases of my life, it's still up there as definitely one of my favorites, and certainly a little bit of inspiration for, anytime I delve into a character who feels isolated and unsure, and which is a lot of my characters in young adult fiction. So.
Yeah, I'm really glad you chose it. I've said this before. I think I said it to you, but in the virtual green room beforehand. But I love the Author Shelf series in part because I get to read books like this, or I should say I have to read books like this. And then it turns out, you really should have read this years ago. This is fantastic. So like we did one, Brian McClellan shows a biography of a revolutionary French officer. Brent Weeks did the Odyssey, things that you might not think, I should sit down and, first of all, I'm going to get bombed by the jets overhead, but you don't think, oh yeah, I'm going to sit down and read Rebecca because it's a Tuesday and I've got a few hours. Like, no, you don't.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have picked this up. So thank you for doing it. For recommending the book. I love stuff like this that comes out of left field for me. So, Alyson, tell us a little bit about Stealing Infinity. It comes out June 28th, which, if I do my job, is tomorrow for people listening to this or watching the YouTube video. So tell us a little bit about Stealing Infinity.
Stealing Infinity. The elevator pitch is a teen girl with an unusual gift gets kicked out of school and sent to a secret academy for time travelers, where she must solve an elaborate puzzle of history and time. One where she finds out she just might be one of the missing pieces. And it's being pitched as the Da Vinci Code meets Riverdale, which I'm good with that.
Yeah, nice.
That works for me.
Yeah. So that's the elevator pitch. That's fantastic. Is there anything else that you want to tell people about it and how it came to be and what was the germ of this book? Yeah,
I had taken 5 years off from writing anything really. I thought I might be retired. I had written like 27 books in, a fairly short amount of time. And I had traveled to 5 continents doing book tours and just a really, really busy nonstop go kind of time. And I got to a point of just being so burnt out creatively on the business, all of it. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to step back for a while. And that turned into 5 years. In my head, though, because, writers are always writing. You're always collecting stories. You can't listen to a conversation and not try to turn these 2 people into characters. It's just something we're always doing. And then the pandemic hit and, I'm usually at home, but now I had to be at home. And I just thought, well, I do have this idea I've been playing with, a time travel academy. So maybe I'll just sit down and write this. And, there was so much fear and uncertainty of that time. And so I found it really enjoyable to sit down at the computer and create a world of my control and my doing. And I make the rules and I can immerse myself in something else and out of this current world that we were all living in, So it provided a great escape. It provided me a sense of control. And I got that spark back where I was enjoying creating characters and putting words on the page. And for the first time in a long time, there was no worry about what am I going to do with this book and who is it for or any of it. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know if I was going to do anything with it. I was just sitting down writing for the pure pleasure of writing again. And I probably hadn't really done that since the very first book, right? Because once you start getting book deals, now you're doing deadlines and expectations and all of that. So it was just a really freeing, fun experience. And of course, by the time I finished, I got practical and called my agent, and said, well, maybe I'm coming back. So that was the journey of it. But it was nice to be able to sort of take my time and I guess there are similarities to things that I've written before in that, it's a young adult. There's a heavy romantic element. There's a heavy sort of supernatural element, fantasy element to it. But it does include themes and ideas that I haven't explored before. And that was really fun too.
Yeah, there's nothing. So I'm not a creative on the same level as you are, Alyson, but I can say there's nothing quite as satisfying as feeling that burnout and thinking, this might be it. I need to go find something else to do with my life. And then it comes back and it hits you and you're like, all right, I'm ready to do some more stuff. It's really a great feeling. So mazel tov on that. That's really fantastic. All right. Well, let's wrap it up there. I hope everybody will go check out Stealing Infinity. Again, comes out June 28th. So yeah, pretty much out by the time you hear this. Please go check it out. Alyson Noël, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. And hope you enjoyed your time on the author's shelf.
I loved it. Thanks so much for having me. It's really nice meeting you guys.
Cheers. And thank you, Stephanie. And thanks to everybody for listening. Again, go to thelegendarium.com. You can find links there I mentioned Patreon at the beginning of the episode. Yes, we would love your support. If you like what we do, it means a lot and, keeps this ship afloat if you pitch in a little bit. So that's great. But it also has a link to our Discord server where there are, Stephanie, do you know, it's like 1,300 people now, all jibber jabbering about fantasy literature, and it's fantastic. It's the nicest corner of the internet. I can't recommend it highly enough. And I know that with a book like Rebecca, there's a lot of stuff that we didn't get to in this conversation. And so if you'd like to continue the discussion, let's do it there. So go check out the Discord link if you haven't yet. You'll find it at thelegendarium.com. Stephanie, Alyson, listeners, thank you again, and we will see you next time.